But it is the poverty on our reserves that keep this vicious cycle going. The average yearly reserve income is $9,000, which is less than half of the national average. To complicate matters, because of restrictions in the Indian Act, it makes it hard for Aboriginals to secure loans and mortgages for fixing or constructing homes. In an attempt to emphasize Native control of their own communities and to encourage the use of local resources in construction, such as gravel and timber, the federal government in 1996 introduced a new approach to on-reserve housing. This policy is voluntary on the part of the natives, and it has been adopted by only a handful of bands. Recently, in 2006, the Liberal government promised to budget $5.1 billion to help improve both the social and economic standards of First Nations people at the Kelowna Accord. The Harper Conservative government has since reneged on the deal. This pattern of making very little progress can be seen in the educating of our First Nation people. Education has been one of the prime tools used by Canadian society to absorb and assimilate Aboriginals. Prior to 1951, the Indian Act forbade Aboriginals from attending university without giving up their Indian status. In 1969, the White Paper was tabled, which Natives saw as another attempt by the dominant society to try and assimilate Aboriginals into mainstream Canadian culture by making them legally indistinguishable from other Canadians. This was not tolerable to Canadian Natives, who wanted to protect their culture and language. In response, the First Nations in Canada issued a policy document in 1972 called Indian Control of Education, which demanded the right of Aboriginal people to control the education of their children. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, there seemed to be an increased cultural awareness and accountability to Aboriginals. However, despite mainstream Canada's acquiring sensitivity, reserve schools were closing down at an alarming rate. That problem still persists today. With many Native children already lagging 3 years behind in school, educators say school closings are the last thing these children need. Many of the schools that are still in operation are fraught with major obstacles. In an article in the Toronto Star dated November 2005, Joyce Kagagamek Nishinawabi Aski, Nation Deputy Chief of Education, said, "Our schools are in a crisis situation with health and safety. There's such a serious problem with mold, building structure, water quality, and crowding." Without reliable education, there cannot be any hope for good employment. According to the Aboriginal Job Centre, there are 369 jobs available in Canada to First Nations people. This is pathetically low, seeing as there are 976,310 Aboriginals in Canada. Not only are there very few jobs, but also most Natives have to go through an Aboriginal agency to get a higher paying job. Employment for Canada's disenfranchised has been debated since the 1950s, when new statutes, including the 1977 Canadian Human Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination, were brought into being. This equal opportunity did not translate into any significant change in the unemployment statistics of the First Nations. For Aboriginals, the unemployment rate is 19.1% compared to that of the total Canadian population, which is at 7.4%. In order to raise themselves up and out of the poverty that they experience, no one can deny that natives need to be self-sufficient and employed. Spending money on programs that do not significantly change living conditions for the Aboriginals is not the answer. Economic growth and development is. There are sections of the Indian Act 29, 87, 89, and 90 that forbid commercial credit on a reserve and thereby create a real reluctance for non-native investors to put a business on a reserve. What investor would risk total capital loss because a section in the Indian Act forbids non-natives from seizing assets on reserves? First Nations collective property rights to reserves total more than 2.7 million hectares to date, and these totals are growing as Aboriginals and treaty claims are settled. These large amounts of land will never live up to their economic potential and benefit for First Nation people as long as they are held as collective property subject to political management. Canadians spend approximately $10 billion each year in federal and provincial funds on Aboriginal affairs with very little to show for it. Policy that has been enacted since 1945 has been progressive in theory, but very little action has been carried out. Canadians are often emotionally moved by the visions of impoverished children in third world countries, but are ignorant to the fact that some of our own First Nation people live in a similar condition. Today there is unsafe drinking water, crowded housing, insufficient education, low employment, and lack of economic opportunity on Canada's reserves. This vicious cycle is hard to break when the Indian Act seems to support it. The Indian Act needs major amending or to be repealed so that our First Nations people can flourish and not just merely survive. We must not overlook them any longer.